Joining us today for PolicyEngine's Year in Review. For those who are new to our work, we're a charity that builds free open source software that lets anyone analyze how economic policies affect societies and individuals in both the US and the UK. 2024 has been a transformative year in demonstrating what's possible with our platform. What I'm most proud of is how our modeling has contributed to important policy discussions this year, from the spring budget to manifesto analyses, private school VAT to employer national insurance reforms. But more importantly, we've made these analytical capabilities freely available to everyone through our open source tools. I'll now hand it over to Nikhil and Vahid to walk through our progress this year and preview some exciting developments coming in 2025. Nikhil?
Thank you, Max. Okay, so from the start of the year, this year, there's been a pretty unprecedented number of fiscal events, different policy proposals. And at PolicyEngine, we have been putting out scores so that people can easily compare the impacts and compute the impacts of this public policy sort of raft of decisions for them. So I'm going to start at the start of the year, or as close as in terms of policy proposals, with the spring budget. And we'll go through the entire of the year with all of the policy proposals that we modelled and what we said about them. So the first major fiscal event was the spring budget of 2024. So this was under the Conservative government led by Rishi Sunak. And there were a few different reforms in here. The first one was a fuel duty freeze. So this is quite a common reform that we see a lot over the past sort of decade. Essentially, fuel duty is changed to inflation, but every year for the past at least sort of 6 or 7 years, the government of the time has frozen it. Our baseline choice here is to assume that the policy will go up with inflation. This is the same as the Office of Budget Responsibilities. So we model the impacts of freezing it against the counterfactual of raising fuel duty, which is a flat fee for each litre of petrol or diesel. And we've got that in this table here. There were also some other tax policy decisions taken here. So the child benefit high income tax charge is essentially a kind of means test of child benefit, but done through a tax charge that recoups some of the child benefit that you've received. So we estimated that this sort of relaxation of the child benefit high income tax charge phase outs, making it phase out over a longer period of earnings, cost essentially 1.4 billion in lost revenues. There were also some national insurance reforms. So class 1, the amount of like national insurance paid by employees, and also class 4, which is paid by the self-employed. We ended up actually scoring these as, like others, pretty high costing in terms of lost revenue tax cuts. So 10 billion from the class 1 cuts and 1 billion from the class 4 cut. So when you put all these together, the spring budget was a pretty huge tax policy change, amounting to about 14.1 billion in lost tax revenues. We estimate that about 80% of people in the UK gains income from this, that it changed poverty around minus 0.4%, so pretty small, and then it also increased inequality. So for each one of these, you can essentially see the individual PolicyEngine model score and for the combined reform as well. The next thing that we're going to walk through wasn't a policy decision, but was a kind of broader analysis of the household outlook for UK households over 2024. So in the spring, the OBR released their March 2024 economic and fiscal outlook. This essentially underlies all of the government budgeting. The estimates for tax revenues, benefit spendings, all come from these OBR EFOs. So when this happens, we update our forecasts to be consistent with this. And doing that, we can essentially pull out from the model estimates for what is the path of disposable incomes for each income decile. So by comparing the projected incomes, applying these OBR growth factors to individual households, we can get a picture of what the distributional impact of just current policy looks like over the next few years. So finding some large income growth for a lot of the distribution of income in 2022, some pretty broad cuts over 2023 and 2024, and then a kind of really mixed but generally quite close to 0% change picture over successive years. The next policy decision that happened was the triple lock plus. So this was later in the spring and was a policy reform introduced by the Conservative government as an intention for them to later implement it. Essentially, the triple lock is the government rule that says that every year, state pension recipients will see their state pension per year rise by 2.5%, average earnings, or inflation, whichever is higher. The triple lock plus would essentially increase this by also adding, and I'll also show the main article here. Essentially, this would also add another step to this. So because the situation was that with state pensions rising by this amount, a lot of pensioners will be brought into paying income tax. But what this reform would do it would also increase the personal allowance every year automatically to make this an impossibility. So having a pensioner-specific personal allowance that rises with the triple lock while keeping the main personal allowance the same. So this is essentially a very specifically designed policy to prevent pensioners who are just receiving the state pension from paying income tax at all. We estimate that the benefits from this would largely flow to lower income deciles, and it would benefit about 12% of the population, pretty much just pensioners, and that it would cost about £1.3 billion per year by 2027. Around this time, we started seeing election manifestos come out because Rishi Sunak called the election, and I think the first one that came out actually was the Liberal Democrat manifesto. So this was a more tax and spend heavy manifesto, around 26 billion of tax rises and 26 billion of benefit spending rises or public service spending rises. Across a lot of different areas, so things from capital gains, but also general public service spending increases. So as you can see from the chart, we estimate that this really strongly affects, so changes the net income of more than 5%, about 40% of the population. So 40% of the population would experience some quite dramatic change in their disposable incomes. We estimate that, like they say, the reforms will be budget neutral, and they would benefit 70% of the population in some way by increasing their net income. We estimate that they would have quite large, compared to most reforms that we've seen, poverty rate effects. So reducing overall poverty by a fifth and child poverty by a quarter. And this amounts to about 2.4 million people. And it also reduces income inequality by about 3%. The next manifesto that we analysed was the Labour Party manifesto. This is a much smaller in terms of the size of the redistribution manifesto. So essentially redistributing about 4 billion compared to the 26 billion in the Liberal Democrat manifesto. We estimate this causes a small reduction in absolute poverty, but benefits about 73% of the population. So slightly more, but lower magnitude of impacts across the board. This included policies like the flagship raise on private school VAT, but most of the policies were sort of around changes to public service spending budgets. The Conservative manifesto as well was released around this time. And this essentially proposes a £5.8 billion spending increase. So they said it was budget neutral. We actually estimated that it would have less tax revenue increases than they estimated. We estimate that actually most people would be worse off by a very small majority of 48%. And we estimate that most of the benefits in this would flow to higher income deciles. This is mostly because a lot of their policies, for example, the cuts to national insurance, so reducing the rates of payroll taxes that earners pay, which benefits high income earners more. but also benefit cuts. There were a lot of proposals for making means tests stricter and sort of cutting down on disability benefit uptake. So a slightly different sort of shape or distributional impact for this compared to the other two manifestos. Vahid, do you want to talk about the private school VAT reform?
Sure. Yeah, on the analysis about the private school VAT, the Labour proposed actually they want to consider a kind of VAT for the private school VAT tax, and we have also include a kind of distribution analysis and also budgetary impact analysis for this reform. As you can see here, we just include the distribution analysis about this reform. That for the top decile, you can see that the kind of about the 11% of the 10th decile, they lost more than 5%. And you can see that for the lower decile, there is kind of no group of people to actually lose any welfare from that. Yeah, the policy engine estimate from this reform that would generate £1.5 billion revenue annually, and over 5 years, it's totally sum to £7.7 billion. It also affects 3.3% of the population, mostly on the higher income household. And also, it is slightly reduce income inequality by measuring Gini index. So, Nikhil.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so moving on, the private school VAT reform was one that was really likely that was going to come through. It was a key manifesto promise. But around the time of the autumn budget, there were plenty of other kind of like leaked proposals at different levels of kind of likelihood for what would be in the autumn budget, so the first fiscal event of the new government. We focused on four, which had been widely reported as going to happen. So the first one of these was a general tax avoidance measure. Essentially reforming the non-domicile status at which you can sort of be resident in the UK but not pay tax on worldwide income. We assume that this is incident on wealth in accordance with the evidence. We don't model that directly. The other three, however, we do. So levying private school VAT, that was widely reported as happening. Raising capital gains tax to 24%, so the higher rates going to 24%. And then also levying employer national insurance contributions on employer pension contributions. So currently, employers, when employers contribute to their employees' pension schemes, they don't have to pay payroll taxes on that employer contribution. This would change that, and it would mean that they do have to pay a, for example, a 10% flat sort of tax rate on those pension contributions. So the chart here actually kind of shows the distributional impact of each one separately, but also combined. So we estimate that this would largely raise a lot of revenue from the top decile, mostly because of the non-dom reform and also the capital gains reform. We estimated that around 23 billion in tax revenues would be the increase that these reforms would cost. And yeah, mostly affecting the top sort of third of the income distribution, with no real effect on absolute poverty rates. Most of these reforms only affect you when you're above the poverty rate, for example, through earnings. Moving on, so employer national insurance and pension contributions needed us to actually implement a better way to actually model this, because there are different assumptions about when you raise taxes on employers. Does that fall through to employees? Does it fall through to prices? You know, who does that ultimately affect? Essentially, what we did here was we took different assumptions about the employee instance, so the percentage of an employer's tax rise that they pass on immediately to their employee wages, so between 0 and 100%. And for each one of those assumptions, we estimated what the revenue impact of the reform would be. It decreases if you assume that employees take more of the burden, because when employees have more wages, they pay more income tax and they receive less benefits. And when they have less wages, they do the opposite. So reducing employee wages also reduces income tax revenues, national insurance revenues, and increases benefit spending. So we took that into account. We estimate that the total budgetary impact of this reform could be anywhere between 17 and 10 billion, depending on what the assumptions are about employee instance here. So this was a fairly novel contribution. I don't think anyone else estimated the sort of range of outcomes depending on your assumption here. And then what ended up happening was kind of similar, but kind of different. Unlike what was widely reported in the papers, the employer national insurance raise did not happen on employer pension contributions. It happened across the board. So there was an increase in the employer national insurance contribution rates to 15%. And also the threshold at which employers pay this tax was lowered to £5,000. So more of a broad-based reform and not just specific to pension contributions. So we estimate that this essentially raises 23 billion in 2025 and 110 billion pounds over the 5-year window. We also estimate it's really kind of broad-based, impacting essentially 2/3 of the population and mostly in the sort of top 6 income deciles. There were some other parts of the autumn budget. Vahid, do you want to talk through the remaining parts?
Yeah, sure. The other parts in the other budget was field duty. And actually, we again kind of have a similar distributional analysis on that, depending on the income decile. And yeah, we actually estimate that the freezing field duty from the government side cost 2.4 billion pound in 2025, and also it reduced income inequality by 0.2%. Yeah, as we shown here, there is a kind of distributional analysis on different decile, income decile. You can see that the relative changes in the household income for the top decile is almost 0. So for the top deciles, we can see that there is no effect on them. And for the lower decile, for example, the first decile and second decile, you can see that it has a slightly effect on them by increasing the relative change in household income. Yeah, the other part was the benefit operating plan for the 2025 to 2026. Yeah, Labor had a plan for increasing the benefits by 1.7. This is the kind of projection for the inflation rate for the next year. So we actually estimate that the cost of these kind of Labor's plan for the operating cost government 2.5 billion pound, and it would benefit almost 46% of the population, mainly on the lower income household group, and it also raised the lower income decile net income by almost 1%, versus less than for the top decile, it's almost 0.1%. And it will reduce the, regarding our estimation, it will reduce the poverty rate by 1.8%, and also decrease the income inequality by 0.3%.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's also just worth mentioning. So this is Labour, the Labour government choosing to confirm this, but the actual policy of operating benefits with inflation has been a sort of very long followed precedent. So when we do this analysis, we are considering the counterfactual of if benefits did not rise with inflation. Okay, on the capital gains side, there was some tax reform to capital gains tax in the autumn budget, essentially raising the basic rates to 18% from 10% and putting the higher and additional taxpayer rates at 24%, so rising from 20%. We estimate this affects quite a small number of people. In our microdata, we have imputations for capital gains for people in the UK. And so we estimate, in the top decile, 5% of people lose less than 5% of their income, but 5% see a strong loss, of more than 5% from this reform. Also, to mention on this, we assume a capital gains elasticity of around minus 0.7. So we assume that people do respond to capital gains tax rate changes. Cool. Vahid, do you want to talk through our behavioral responses that we currently model?
Yeah, sure. Actually, we add a kind of cool feature to our analysis. We model the behavior response by including labor supply elasticities and also capital gain elasticities, as Nikhil said. We wrote a kind of analysis, a blog post for the UK and also for the US to how you can use this kind of feature in our modeling. We actually use the CBO rates for the labor supply elasticities and also capital gain elasticities. But we also include the heterogeneity of this kind of elasticities for the labor supply elasticities. So basically, we are calculating the income effect and substitution effect to calculate what happened to the labor supply when the policy reform announced. We actually have an analysis about comparing the kind of static and dynamic analysis on different reforms that the government announced. And you can see that here, for example, for the reform that basic rates increased from 80% to 24% rate. This is the capital gain reform. The static revenue impact is 21.5 billion pound, and the dynamic revenue impact that we estimated is 10.1 billion pound. So you can see that here is a difference when we come from the static to the dynamic analysis. So we think that this is a really important thing because the government and everybody in the policy environment know that if you apply a kind of reform in the labor market, in the labor supply, or also, for example, reforms for the capital gains, you can see that there is a kind of effect in the general equilibrium. So by moving from the static to dynamic, we can have more accurate estimate to what happened in the society.
Nice, thanks. So I think just the final thing on the employer payroll tax instance. So this was a new thing that we introduced for the autumn budget national insurance reforms, essentially following that assumption of assuming that 40% of employer payroll taxes are passed through to employees. Okay, that was our analysis for all the things that happened this year. So definitely welcome you to sort of explore through the blog posts. For each policy reform that we analyze, we make sure to include a link to the kind of reform impact score that has been built using our web app. So every one of the results that you see here, you can rebuild yourself. You can slightly adjust them, examine a slightly different policy reform, see how changing one part of it changes the outputs. But everything that we do here is using the same web app that our sort of collaborators and users use. So just looking ahead.
Nikhil, just to add a point here. Yeah. Also, they can apply different reforms and calculate the household side. So this is a good feature that we have. For example, you can see what happened in the future if the Labour government apply, for example, capital tax rate reform, and what happened to the specific household with the level of income, to see, for example, why is the, for example, different rates, what is the different rate of, for example, tax here, and by adjusting the characteristics of the household, they can compute anything from this side.
Yeah, no, definitely, great point. Okay, so with all that said, we've got some really exciting plans for what we're going to be releasing next year. And these include, among others, local area modeling. So we've presented some national impacts here, but imagine if for each one of these policy reforms, you could examine the impact by constituency, by local authority. So we're going to be releasing a feature that will enable us to report on that and enable you to use the model in that way. We'll also be adding support for childcare subsidies modeling. So, for example, free entitlements to childcare, and we'll be able to see how changing details of that policy will affect UK households and also at the local levels. And then also, finally here, public services spending. So, cash benefits make up around a third of government spending, but the other parts of this are spending on programs that don't immediately have a cash value to households, so things like healthcare services. With support from the Nuffield Foundation, we're going to be sort of making headway on each one of those. But I think particularly we want to give you a little bit of a heads up into our local area modelling plans. So, Vahid, do you want to talk through some of this?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the first step for the local area analysis is that we are enhancing our data set that we have. We are using different approach, different machine learning methods to do that. And actually, yeah, we have a kind of survey data on 100 households. And you have also, we first want to start from the constituency level. So we have 650 constituencies. And also we have 360 local authority districts. So we have basically more than 20,000 statistical targets. So by micro simulation techniques, we want to actually learn our model to actually give the less error possible that we can take from the modeling. And yeah, we actually basically estimate the weights of each household in each constituency or local authority area to target the weights that we have. So basically we have some targets and we are estimating the weights and level of each household to get the best result.
Thank you. Okay. And I don't know, do you want to talk to the sort of like general results?
You can go ahead and then I can complete that.
Okay, cool. All right, well, I'll talk a little bit about the interface that we've got planned for how you actually like to use this. So as you can see on the left, we've been sort of working quite hard at making it so that if you want to actually use the weights and things that we've been developing, it's not that hard. So for example, we've got 4 code cells here. The first one installs the package. The second one passes in a password to basically access the data. The third one essentially builds and initializes a simulation. And the fourth one shows a map of for example, the impact of a tax reform here, the personal allowance reform, by political constituency. So all of those things combined, really kind of like fast, really easy to actually just get out the numbers that you want from the model.
It couldn't be easier.
Well, we kind of run into the boundaries before. Like each of these things is kind of as streamlined as it physically can be. We need to sort of check data access requirements and things like that.
And also we should include that we spent a lot of time to document everything. So we have a good at documentation on each level, on each analysis and methodology that we apply.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like it's definitely quite important. We think that it is both easy to ask like the common questions, like how much does this policy cost? How much does this policy cost? Things like that. But also there are lots of less common analysis types that people still care about. So like, what if I thought of a policy and then I said, I want to know how this policy affects median earnings or median disposable income by constituency? Even then, you're straight into like niche territory. So we want to make it easy for people to find, from a list of 100 different output types, which one correlates with the specific thing they're after. We also do a ton of work on validation. So we have updated our validation documentation site for the UK. We've added in national, parliamentary constituency and local authority pages. And each one of those pages basically shows everything that we calibrate to. So how does our model do at reproducing the number of people with earnings between 20 and 30K in Birmingham, right? That's a single metric. We can see how we compare to the administrative total. We're within 1%, so that's great. So for each one of the things that we care about, we think is important, you can see how close we are to administrative estimates and things like that. And then we also have more kind of prose level documentation, basically walking through, here's what we've done, here's how it works, here are the different parts we built to sort of bring it together. So more kind of detail there. And with that, thank you for watching. I'll pass it back to Max.
Yes, thank you all for joining today. As you can see, we've covered an enormous range of policy areas this year, both in terms of responding to new events and also preparing our models for those kinds of analyses and even more in 2025. I want to thank the Nuffield Foundation as well for, again, supporting the really ambitious projects that we're looking to expand to even in the US. I think this is going to push the global frontier of tax benefit microsimulation analysis. And we welcome you to join the conversation, join our community, use the tools. Let us know if you have questions or feedback or suggestions. And we're very excited to continue these monthly training sessions going into next year. With that, have a wonderful holiday season and Happy New Year.